They call him the ghost of Seoul, a man who carves empires out of bone and shadow. Tonight, Alexander Hyun didn't just buy a debt, he bought my life. He looked at me across the contract with eyes that had forgotten how to feel and told me I was his wife. But when the doors locked and the world went silent, I didn't see the monster everyone fears. I saw a man carrying a secret that began 20 years before I was born. People think I'm the victim in this forced marriage, but they don't know that I'm the only one who can make a god bleed. Stay until the end to discover why Alexander's first touch didn't break me. It awakened a power I never knew I possessed. Before we dive into the mystery of why Alexander chose an innocent girl over a dynasty, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Comment, Mafia Queen, if you think Marvis should fight back or give in if she should trust her heart. The air in the underground gala was thick, heavy with the cloying scent of expensive cigars and the invisible, sharp tang of cold desperation. It was a room where everything had a price, and tonight, the currency was flesh and blood. Marvis stood at the center of the red velvet stage, her chocolate skin glowing with a radiant, ethereal light under the unforgiving glare of the harsh spotlights. At 19, she was a masterpiece of youthful defiance. While other girls might have crumbled, Marvis remained a statue of obsidian grace, her bold features locked in a mask of silent strength that refused to shatter under the hungry, predatory stares of the elite. To the wealthy men in the shadows, she was weird. She didn't wail or beg for mercy. Instead, she was too silent, her dark, observant eyes constantly tracking the exits and the movement of the guards rather than weeping. She was a puzzle they couldn't solve, a girl who looked at a cage and saw a challenge. Then, the temperature in the room seemed to drop until the air itself went ice cold. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open, and the world went silent. Alexander Hyun walked in. At 46, he moved with a predatory grace that commanded the very oxygen in the room. He was a king who had never known the bitter taste of defeat, and his presence felt like the arrival of a storm. The silver streaks in his hair shimmered like blades under the chandeliers, and his sharp jawline was a mask of unyielding stone. He didn't look at the other bidders. His gaze was a laser, cutting through the smoke and the noise until it landed squarely on Marvis. The auctioneer began his frantic chant, but it was cut short before the first second had passed. Alexander didn't shout. He didn't play the games of the lesser men in the room. He simply raised one gloved hand, a silent gesture that carried the weight of an empire. The room held its breath. The bidding didn't just slow down, it stopped dead. No one dared to challenge the ghost of Seoul. Alexander stepped toward the stage, his dark eyes locking onto Marvis with an intensity that felt like a physical brand. In that moment, it was clear to everyone watching. He didn't just want her. He was claiming her as if she were a long-lost piece of his soul that had been stolen from him lifetimes ago. Marvis looked down at the man who had just bought her life, and for the first time that night, she felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The transition from the blinding spotlights of the gala to the interior of the black luxury sedan was jarring. The car moved through the streets of Seoul with a ghostly silence, the tinted windows cutting off the world outside. To Marvis, the plush leather and polished wood didn't feel like wealth. They felt like the interior of a rolling coffin. She sat as far into the corner as possible, her breath shallow, watching the neon lights of the city streak past like blurred memories. Beside her sat Alexander. He had shed his dress shirt, wearing only his tailored blazer draped over his broad shoulders. In the rhythmic flicker of the passing streetlights, Marvis could see the dark, intricate ink of dragon tattoos winding upward from his chest, coiling around his neck like ancient guardians. The sight was mesmerizing and terrifying. He didn't look at her, yet his presence filled the entire cabin, radiating a cold, magnetic power. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was a heavy, living thing that seemed to press against Marvis's chest. She found herself staring at his hands, which rested casually on his knees. They were large, calloused, and marked by jagged white scars, lines of a map that told stories of 1,000 battles fought in the dark. These were hands that knew how to break things, yet they held the steering wheel of her destiny now. Marvis took a breath, forcing her heart to steady. She was done being a silent passenger in her own life. "Why me?" she finally asked. Her voice was steady and bold, cutting through the hum of the engine. Alexander didn't turn his head. He remained perfectly still, his profile looking like it had been carved from granite. A long moment passed before he spoke, and when he did, his voice was a low, gravelly murmur that seemed to vibrate through the very seat. "Because you are the only thing in this city that doesn't have a price tag, Marvis," he said. The words were soft, but they carried the weight of an absolute truth. The vibration of his voice felt like a low hum of electricity against her skin, making the fine hairs on her arms stand up. He wasn't looking at her as a prize or a possession. He was looking at her as something rare, something he couldn't simply buy with money, even though he just had. As the car sped toward his private empire, Marvis realized that while the contract was made of iron, the man beside her was made of something far more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. The elevator rose in a blur of motion, opening directly into a world of glass and cold stone. The penthouse was a masterpiece of architectural isolation, overlooking the glowing, neon veins of Seoul far below. To anyone else, it was the peak of luxury, but to Marvis, the atmosphere felt suffocatingly lonely. The air was thin and sterile, smelling of expensive leather and the ghost of rain. Alexander moved through the space with the ease of a man who owned the sky. He led her deeper into the residence, past silent corridors, until they reached a master bedroom bathed in the pale, silvery glow of the moon. There were no lamps lit, only the cold light reflecting off the dark marble floors. In the center of the room, Alexander stopped. He still hadn't looked back at her. With a deliberate slowness that made the air feel heavy, he began to unbutton his shirt. Marvis stood by the door, her hands clutching the fabric of her dress, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird desperate for escape. She expected the worst, expected the monster from the gala to finally show his teeth. As the black silk fell away from his broad shoulders, the moonlight caught the skin of his back. Marvis gasped, her eyes widening. Across his spine, amidst the dragons and the scars, was a sprawling tattoo of a withered, drooping rose. It was a strange, hauntingly soft image for a man known for his ruthlessness. The petals looked as if they were falling, a permanent mark of grief etched into his very bone. Alexander turned slowly, the shadows playing across the hard planes of his stomach and the ink on his chest. His eyes were dark, unreadable pools in the moonlight. He looked at her not with hunger, but with a weary, ancient weight. "You are my wife now," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that filled the quiet room. "In name, in blood, and in shadow." He stepped closer, his presence looming over her, but he didn't reach out to touch her. He stood just far enough away that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "But I am a man of meaningful silences," he continued, his gaze dropping to the rose locket hidden beneath her collarbone before meeting her eyes again. "I will not take what is not given. This room is yours. The choice is yours. In this house I am the law, but I am not your master." Marvis watched him, her bold spirit flickering with a new kind of confusion. As he walked toward the balcony, leaving her alone in the moonlight, she realized that the ghost of Seoul was haunted by something far more painful than she had ever imagined. The days that followed were a blur of golden sunlight and cold marble. Marvis lived in a world of silent luxury, where every need was met by invisible hands, but her mind was never at rest. She spent most of her hours in the vast, two-story library, surrounded by thousands of books that smelled of aging paper and history. However, she wasn't interested in the stories on the shelves. She was studying the living mystery that moved through the house. She became an expert in the small details of Alexander Hyun. She noticed the way his jaw tightened when the rain began to lash against the floor-to-ceiling windows, as if the sound of water brought back a memory he couldn't escape. She watched from the shadows as he stood in his study, staring at a faded, dog-eared photograph of a woman with high cheekbones and a radiant smile, a woman who looked strikingly like Marvis herself. One humid evening, the air thick with the scent of coming storms, she found him in the rooftop garden. The ghost of Seoul was alone, his tailored jacket discarded on a stone bench. He stood by a trellis of blooming jasmine, his hand hovering inches away from the delicate white petals. In the moonlight, he didn't look like a ruthless king. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff. He looked vulnerable, a ruler who had finally taken off his heavy armor. Marvis didn't stay in the shadows this time. Her bold spirit pushed her forward, her bare feet silent on the grass as she stepped into his personal space. The distance between them vanished until she could smell the sandalwood on his skin and the faint, sharp scent of the jasmine. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as they grazed the dark ink on his forearm. His skin was hot, a stark contrast to the cool night air. Marvis expected him to flinch, to growl a command, or to pull away into the safety of his coldness. Instead, Alexander stayed perfectly still. He didn't move an inch. As her touch lingered over the scars hidden beneath the dragon tattoos, his head tilted back slightly. He closed his eyes, and a long, shuddering breath escaped his lips, a sound so raw and filled with relief that it made her heart ache. In that small, silent moment, the wall between the captor and the captive began to crumble, revealing a wound that no amount of power could ever heal. What is the secret connection between Marvis and the woman in the photo? Type mother or coincidence in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button to reveal the truth in the next chapter. The fragile peace of the garden was a lie, a thin veil draped over a brewing war. While Marvis and Alexander found solace in the silence, the world outside was screaming for blood. The syndicate elders, men who had grown old and bitter in the pursuit of power, were furious. To them, Alexander's marriage wasn't a choice. It was a betrayal. He had married an outsider, a girl of chocolate skin and bold eyes, instead of cementing a political alliance with a rival dynasty. The tension finally boiled over during a formal dinner that felt less like a meal and more like a trial. The dining hall was a cavern of dark wood and flickering candlelight, filled with men whose eyes were as sharp as the silver cutlery. Marvis sat at the head of the table beside Alexander, her spine straight, refusing to let their judgmental glares shrink her spirit. The air curdled when one elder, a man with a face like crumpled parchment, leaned forward. He threw a jagged insult at the table, mocking Marvis's heritage and calling her a stain on the prestigious Hyun bloodline. The room went deathly silent. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Alexander didn't yell. He didn't flip the table or reach for a weapon. He simply stopped eating and placed his steak knife down on the white linen cloth with a slow, deliberate click. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees in an instant. Alexander turned his head, his silver-streaked hair catching the light as he looked directly at the man. His eyes were no longer those of the man who breathed softly in the garden. They were the eyes of the ghost of Seoul. "If you breathe her name again," Alexander whispered. His voice was a lethal rasp, so quiet it was terrifying. "I will ensure your bloodline ends tonight. I will burn your legacy until not even the ash remembers who you were." The elder turned pale, the air leaving his lungs. Alexander didn't wait for an apology. He stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the marble floor. He reached out and grabbed Marvis's hand, his large palm engulfing hers. His grip was possessive and firm, a silent declaration to the room that she was his and his alone. Yet even in his fury, he was careful not to squeeze too hard. He pulled her from the room, their footsteps echoing like thunder in the stunned silence. As they stepped into the hallway, Marvis realized that being protected by a monster was just as intoxicating as it was terrifying. The heavy mahogany doors of the penthouse slammed shut, echoing like a gunshot through the silent apartment. The air between them was vibrating, thick with the adrenaline of the confrontation and the dangerous heat of things left unsaid. Alexander didn't walk away this time. The threat from the elders had stripped away his restraint, awakening a raw, protective hunger that he could no longer hide behind a mask of stone. Before Marvis could draw a breath, he was there. He moved with a speed that defied his size, pinning her against the door. His body was a solid wall of heat and muscle, his hands framing her head as he leaned in close. The scent of sandalwood and rain was overwhelming. For the first time, the ghost of Seoul looked truly haunted, not by the past, but by the fear of losing the woman standing in front of him. "They want to take you," he growled, his voice dropping into a dark, guttural register that sent a shiver straight to her core. "They know you're my only weakness. They know you're the only thing in this godforsaken world that makes me feel human." Marvis didn't shrink away. She didn't tremble. Her bold spirit rose to meet his fury, her eyes searching the dark, swirling depths of his. She could feel the erratic thrum of his heart against her own chest. She reached up, her chocolate skin a beautiful contrast against the silver at his temples, and tangled her fingers in his hair. "Then stop being a god to them," she challenged, her voice a steady, breathless whisper. "And be a man for me." The kiss that followed was a collision, a violent, beautiful wreck of years of loneliness and weeks of suppressed desire. It wasn't soft, it was a desperate claim. It tasted of salt, iron, and a hunger that had been starving in the dark for far too long. In that moment, the hierarchy of the Mafia, the contracts, and the elders vanished. There was only the fire burning between a man who had forgotten how to feel and a girl who was brave enough to teach him. As Alexander's hands slid down to pull her flush against him, Marvis realized that she wasn't just his wife in name anymore. She was the spark that was about to burn his entire world down. The penthouse was finally still, the only sound being the distant, rhythmic hum of the city and Alexander's steady breathing beside her. He slept with a strange, heavy exhaustion, his tattooed arm thrown across the silk sheets. Marvis lay awake, the heat of their earlier connection still humming in her veins, but her mind was restless. Her weird, observant nature wouldn't let her sleep. Something about the way he had looked at her, not just with desire, but with a crushing weight of history, pushed her out of bed. She moved like a shadow to his mahogany nightstand. Her fingers trailed over the wood until they found a nearly invisible seam. With a soft click, a hidden drawer slid open. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was an antique silver locket, tarnished by time and tears. Marvis held her breath as she clicked it open. She expected to see the face of the woman from the photograph, but what she found was far more haunting. Tucked behind the glass was a tiny, yellowed scrap of paper, a letter written in a cramped, emotional hand. It wasn't a love note. It was a letter addressed to a child that was never born. As Marvis read the words, the world seemed to tilt. The date on the letter was exactly 20 years ago, the same year Alexander's parents had been brutally murdered in a syndicate coup. The letter spoke of a debt that could never be repaid and a man named Marcus, her father. The truth hit her like a physical blow. Her father hadn't just been a low-level associate. He was the man who had stood in the line of fire, giving his life so that a young Alexander Hyun could escape the massacre. Alexander hadn't married her for lust or to satisfy a whim. He hadn't bought her to own her. He had married her because she was his living penance. She was the daughter of the man who had died so he could live. He had spent 2 decades watching her from the shadows, building an empire just to ensure she would never want for anything. Marvis looked at the sleeping man, his dragon tattoos visible in the moonlight, and realized the terrifying depth of his obsession. She wasn't just his wife. She was the one thing in the world he was sworn to protect, an innocent life he would guard even if it meant destroying himself and everything he had built. She was his salvation and his greatest secret. The silvery light of the moon had shifted, casting long, skeletal shadows across the room as Alexander stirred. His eyes snapped open with the instinct of a man who spent his life expecting an assassin in the dark. He sat up, his tattooed chest heaving, and his gaze immediately landed on Marvis. She was standing by the nightstand, the silver locket dangling from her fingers like a heavy secret. In an instant, the warmth from the night before evaporated. The mask of the ghost of Seoul slammed back into place, cold, ruthless, and terrifyingly distant. He slid out of bed, his movements slow and deliberate, moving toward her with the silent, predatory grace that made his enemies tremble. "Put it back, Marvis," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated in the small space between them. "You weren't supposed to find that. Some doors are locked for a reason." He reached out to snatch the locket, but for the first time, Marvis didn't flinch at his shadow. Her bold spirit flared into a white-hot flame. Instead of backing away, she stepped directly into his path, slamming her hand against his bare, ink-covered chest. She pressed the cold silver of the locket right over his hammering heart. "You didn't force me into this marriage because you're a monster, Alexander," she cried, her voice cracking with the weight of the truth. Tears blurred her vision, but her gaze remained locked on his. "And you didn't buy my father's debt just to own me. You did it because you're a coward." Alexander froze. his hand hovering in midair, his jaw tightening so hard it looked like marble. "You're a coward who's afraid to be alone with his grief," she continued, her words hitting him harder than any bullet. "You've spent 20 years hiding behind these tattoos and this empire because you can't face the fact that you survived and they didn't. You don't love me as a prize. You love me as a shield against your own soul." For a heartbeat, the room was so silent they could hear the wind howling against the glass. Then, the mask shattered. The terrifying Mafia boss vanished, and in his place stood a man who looked utterly broken. His dark eyes filled with a raw, agonizing vulnerability that Marvis had never seen. A single, silent tear escaped, trailing down his scarred cheek. All the power and the fury drained out of him as he slumped forward, pulling her into a crushing, desperate embrace. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. In that moment, the debt was gone. There was no king and no captive, only two souls finally clinging to each other in the wreckage of a 20-year-old storm. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and smelling of rain-washed stone. Alexander and Marvis stood together on the expansive glass balcony, the cool morning breeze tugging at the edges of their silk robes. Below them, Seoul was waking up. A sprawling grid of neon and steel that looked like a living circuit board. The city was still a dangerous place, filled with shadows and the low growl of the elders who were still hunting for a way to reclaim their power. But as the first light of dawn touched the horizon, it was clear that the world they had walked into the night before had ceased to exist. Everything had changed in the quiet of the penthouse. Alexander wasn't the man who owned her anymore. The chains of the contract had melted away in the heat of the truth. He was no longer her captor, but the man who belonged to her, soul, shadow, and blood. Alexander turned to her, his silver-streaked hair catching the pale violet light of the morning. The coldness in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, unwavering devotion. He reached into his pocket and produced a small velvet box. Inside wasn't a diamond meant for show or a ring designed to display his wealth. It was a simple, solid gold band, humble and timeless. "The first wedding was for the world," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that felt like a caress. He took her hand, his large, tattooed fingers steady as he slid the gold onto her finger. "That was a transaction. This one is for us." Marvis looked down at the gold reflecting the rising sun. Her weird soul, the one that had always felt out of place and too observant for its own good, had finally found its anchor. She wasn't the innocent girl who had been auctioned off in a room full of monsters anymore. That girl had been consumed by the fire. In her place stood a woman who had seen the heart of the beast and found the man inside. She was a Mafia queen, forged in the darkness and tempered by a love that was never supposed to happen. As the sun finally broke over the skyline, painting the glass of the penthouse in brilliant shades of gold and orange, Alexander pulled her flush against his chest. They stood at the edge of their empire, two scarred souls ready to rule. The elders could come, the world could burn, but they would meet it together. The reign of the ghost and his queen had finally begun. The contract is broken, but the reign has just begun. Do you believe Marvis is safer as a queen or SHOULD she have run while she had the chance? Type queen or run in the comments below. If you loved this emotional saga, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Turn on notifications so you're the first to know when part 2 drops. The War for the Empire begins.